הדוברת הבאה היא פרופסור סוזן סטון. פרופסור סטון היא פרופסור למשפטים ומנהלת המרכז למשפט עברי ותרבות עכשווית בבית הספר למשפטים קרדוזו בישיבה אוניברסיטי, ומשמשת כמרצה אורחת בפקולטה למשפטים באוניברסיטת תל אביב. יש עוד הרבה מה להגיד, אבל הזמן קצר.
מתנצלת, אבל אני מדברת באנגלית. I am much smarter in English. And also you can skip the horrific accent of American inflected Hebrew. So first of all, thank you, Ariel, because I have the experience of being thrown into the deep side of the pool. Now, why do I say that? I am not a philosopher. I am certainly not a philosopher of language, but not even a philosopher. And I am representing a field that for some reason, and we can begin to speculate about that, is rarely dragged anymore into as an explanatory model of what might be the nature of the Bavli. That is law, law and legal theory. So this is interesting. And and I think that actually Ariel's really wonderful book, I thoroughly enjoyed learning an enormous amount of new material, actually creates an opening for it, particularly by choosing Brandom, and I'll come to that in a moment. So I take Ariel's, as he spoke about tonight, that the basic puzzle that is interesting him here is what Karl Mannheim called the problem between the generations. What sort of commitments, if any, did the Amoraim have to the Tanaim? To their rulings, to their cases, to their concepts, to their expressions? What was the nature of the commitment? And in the examples that he has given us in this book, which are really finely grained analyses, he gives us quite a few different sorts of possible relationships. You have situations where a new concept, like in Shinui, a new concept is linked to older cases, and the specific resolution of the cases remains intact. Then there are free-floating new concepts. And then there's a new concept where there's a retention of some kind of technical term, as in the case of Brera, right? But not the rulings themselves. Indeed, the rulings themselves seem to be corrected, right? So this is a very interesting relationship, right, of the present, right, to the past. Now, I gather that Ariel's aim here in this book, as I understood it, is twofold. The first is to some extent to expand on Brandheim's approach to concepts. And the expansion that I see here relates in some respect to what I might call Brandam's Protestantism. And of course, I've never read Brandam, so you'll have to judge what I'm saying, right? Not directly. He's making his way slowly into legal theory, but it's quite limited. And that is that it is quite focused on the individual present speaker. The individual present speaker who definitely, right, converses with, argues with, and perhaps changes his understanding, right, by some kind of debate with another clearly delineated speaker. And if I understood you correctly, Ariel, past speakers are given the same status as individuals in the present, right? They are like the critics. That is, one confronts them, right, with that bridge between them, just as individuals are quite discreet, right, confront one another. Now, in the Bavli, by contrast, in the examples that you've given, that clear wall of separation is often absent, right? Sometimes we can resurrect it, but most often it's collapsed in some way, kind of like an accordion, back and forth. And that creates a very interesting question about how somehow to relate Brandam to the dynamics of a tradition. Right? Is there something, in a way, too Protestant about the way in which he's describing normative structures? I'll come back to that. The second thing, of course, is to present Talmudic discourse as a type of rational discourse that's neither enslaved to the past, nor is it free-floating. So I want to make 4 points. The first has to do with what I perceive to be a certain moment in academic Jewish studies that is paralleling something of a process that went through the field I am familiar with, which is American legal theory. So what is that moment? We might say that there was an early generation of academic inquirers into the nature of the Bavli. And in much of that early generation, like an early 19th, 20th century formulation of legal theory. There's a hard authoritative approach, right? The Amoraim are following the Tanaim, they are following its rules and attempting as much as possible to unearth precisely what the Tanaim said. Right? I mean, I think David Weiss Halivni is an example in many ways of that. Right? Parallel in American legal theory, you have an approach that starts with the notion that judges are appliers of rules. This is what they do. They follow rules. They apply the law, they discover the law, they apply it. The second generation that comes turns this on its head. Now, I'm using second generation here in academic studies as early fish. Early fish, right? I gather late fish has recanted a little bit. But no, you. But early fish, if I recall correctly, having reviewed rational rabbis many, many years ago, right? Early fish, right, put this on its head. Right? The rabbis don't discover the law, they make the law, totally self-consciously, with audacity, right? They are anti-traditionalists. Right? And to that, we might parallel a second move in the history of American legal theory, which was legal realism, in which it was all of a sudden discovered, right? The judges make the law, they don't discover the law, right? They just make it. And why then do they cite all of this stuff from the past? What are they doing that for? So the legal realists had an answer. Why are they doing this? Either they have false consciousness, or else they are deliberately deceiving. Right? They are, in fact, right, using the rhetoric of the past to bolster authority in certain ways, right? They are masking in some way what they're really, that was a large part of the claim of legal realism. Now, as you can imagine, there comes a third way. Now, I view Aryeh as in some way part of a third wave. And it's an interesting third wave. So in American legal studies, that third wave is usually, that third wave is usually identified with, or the third way is usually identified with Dworkin and his successors, right? Some attempt to bring the past back, right? To challenge legal realism from the perspective of this kind of Janus-faced aspect of law, of backwards looking and forward looking, right? And to bring something that will be a kind of mediating, right, theory of the law between these two. I'm going to come back to Dworkin in a moment, but I see Ariel's book in many ways as part of a new third wave of academic Jewish studies. Because first of all, and this is something sometimes rare, that is, it's looking at the Talmud as a normative practice and not just a succession of texts. That's extremely important. Secondly, it is adopting an internal perspective, right? Not without scholarly objectivity, with scholarly objectivity, but a kind of understanding that the way in which a scholar has to describe the work of people engaged in a normative practice is through, right, an internal kind of stance. And secondly, or third rather, I think that he is presenting a new notion of tradition, which has been released from this very, very modern caricature of tradition, a modern caricature of tradition as being based on some kind of hard notion of authority. Now, hard notions of authority, it seems to me, come in more or less when older forms of cohesion collapse, and they're quite modern. Right? They don't really characterize how much of the law has worked for most of the time. Finally, there is here something of a rapprochement with the world of the yeshiva. That, I think, is a very healthy thing. It's an interesting phenomenon in the third wave. In that way, it also in some ways parallels Dworkin, because Dworkin's theory of law is one that insists that there's no separation between the theoretical description of law and the practice of law. And while I'm not urging this kind of collapse, I do think that the kind of theoretical models that Aryel is using, which take very seriously the internal intellectual operation that is going on in the Bavli, is a way at least to connect with some of what goes on in the yeshiva world and to form some kind of bridge language. That might be very healthy. Okay, so having said that, what I want to do here is do what I can do only, which is really to talk a little bit about legal theory. It seems to me something like a missing layer that might be an interesting one to introduce between the philosophy of language and then the fine, fine dissection of the three Talmudic examples that you gave. But in order to do it, I have to set it up. And so, because I think it's important for thinking about tradition-type dynamics, right, which is the central inquiry in this book, right? What kind of dynamics are there, right, in something like a tradition like the Bavli? So what I want to do is pose for you what really lay underneath this third way of Dworkin's. What lay underneath and what was the third way, Dworkin is actually, this is not all of Dworkin, but part of him. What has been most interesting about him is that he has been described as the primary theorist of the Anglo-American common law, of the classical common law. He's a theorist of the common law. He is describing the common law. That creates something already of a way in to some of the evocation of Brandom, who of course himself, right, describes, right, I think, a concept as a normative, right, a normative structure akin something like to a judicial decision, and who looked at Holmes and somehow looks like there's some kind of interesting combination of Holmes and Hegel that's going on here in Brandom. But again, I am second guessing this, and I will let Aryeh come back and talk about that. But if so, then let's look a little bit closely at some of the aspects of the common law that have faded from view in modernity. First of all, Bentham, when he criticized it, said, it's not law, it's philosophy. Now, that's a very interesting and revealing criticism. But why, right? Why did it seem to Bentham to not be law? So perhaps because it is best described as a collective disciplined practice of deliberative reasoning about matters of public import. That is the way in which we might describe what the common law is in its classical formulation. It's characterized naturally by historical continuity. But what we mean by historical continuity is that every single aspect of the rules can have been changed, and yet we understand and recognize it as the very same law. Right? The example that's often given is that of the Argonaut ship, where the shades of Shinui, every plank is, right, removed, every structure is changed, and yet the boat sails home and it's still called the Argonaut. So how is this done? Well, it's achieved through a process that we call integration or reception. That is, there is not rule following, there is the taking up of rules. Rules are matters to be argued over. They're supposed to be taken up and discussed. And secondly, rules are odd creatures. They might also be in the form of cases, examples, but also fiction, that is hypotheticals. Hypotheticals play an extremely prominent role in the common law, and until the modern period of the 19th century, when the common law became a far more written tradition in a formal way, and right, it A, had no doctrine of precedent, and B, it used hypothetical reasoning as much as it used case law. So that's kind of interesting about it. What can we say about that? Well, and finally, right, first of all, what I think it does, and I think this is important, is because I gathered from some of the footnotes in Ariel's book that there's a certain kind of reluctance to look at law and legal theory because of what I think Ariel called the fictional quality, right, of the Talmud, right, in its approach to law. But of course that is, right, if you are in fact using hypotheticals, you're engaged in a world of as if. You are in a fictional world, right? Just as much as you are in some concrete world in which you only use cases that you have actually applied in absolute practice. So I'm not sure that this distinction is really a relevant distinction, right, in terms of what kind of disciplines we want to engage in when we think about what the Bavli is. But finally, I would add one other quality to the common law, which is it's institutionalized. Its institutional form was highly traditional. meaning it's a gerontocracy. It was in the classical period something in which, like a guild, master-student relationships in which the primary form of creativity for the student was the chidush, right? In the old-fashioned sense of what a chidush is, innovation within, right, a very structured realm. So there's an institutional aspect. And it was maintained, in fact, if we think about early common law, we can think about it having been maintained primarily through the vehicle of social institutions like the Inns of Court, which was a place where the judges came from all over the realm, and they came and they ate and they slept, and they dined, and they traded hypotheticals, and they traded cases, and they traded examples, right? That is, they had an institutional structure that is not that dissimilar from the yeshiva. Right? So this is... now, finally, right, there are other features of it that I think are worth noting because they raise some questions about applying the Brandomian structure to the Talmudic discourse. And I want to just put them on the table as questions, since I don't know Brandom at all, right? But I'm surmising. So first of all, what characterizes the kind of deliberative reasoning that happens in the common law that makes it a little bit different from Dworkin too, is that it is extremely focused on collaborative versus individual reasoning. And this is so that the pressure is in some way, there are individuals who are reasoning about the law, but unlike Dworkin's Hercules, who's this solipsistic figure, there's a kind of keen eye in deliberating about how members, right, how the other understands things, right? Not just because they might be taking a different view, but rather because it's important to achieve some level of consensus, right? So that is, there's a kind of social capacity to make judgments that will elicit some kind of recognition and acceptance. So I am wondering about this axis in the Brandom, right, in Brandom's understanding of normative structures. And the second is coherence, right? The coherence that Brandom seems to require, and certainly Dworkin, who follows a similar kind of modern Protestant model, is a really overarching coherence, right? It's really, and I'm not sure about the Bavli. At what level is coherence really aimed for? Is it utter and complete coherence, right? Or is it piecemeal? Right? Is it at some middle level? And I think that's something interesting to keep an eye out, right? In general, in understanding, right, the approach of, an approach to trying to bring rules, examples, wording, expressions into, right, the fabric of the discussion. So having said that, I want to, so I've basically talked a little bit how we might think about ways in which we connect both philosophy of language, which is certainly a part and parcel of legal theory, but also the way in which legal theory relates that to endeavors that really are not far afield from the endeavor of the Bavli, despite, I think, a certain distance that has been falsely created from it, right? This notion that we can have that past decisions or rules are, they're given great weight. They're the evidence of the law, but they're not law. That's the mentality of the common law, right? They're the best evidence we have of the law, but they're not marked as law. And how we might open up a kind of new understanding of what it means to be within a historical tradition, right? One that's freed from very modern conceptions of hard authority, which have, I think, too much gripped us. And then I want to say one last thing, which is a little bit of a point that is, if I gathered correctly, somewhat the opposite of what Menachem just said, which is that what I particularly like about what Aryeh is trying to do here is that it is taking the intellectual operations within the legal discourse seriously on their own, right? And investigating, right, the diachronic dimensions of these intellectual operations. How are they shifting, right? How are they developing? How are they looking? That is one of the most interesting ways of approaching legal thought, to think about the history of legal consciousness, right? To think about the history of legal consciousness, to borrow Duncan Kennedy's way of framing it is to think about the way in which a new form of legal consciousness can emerge, right, that is so shared, right, by those around you that you don't even need to express explicitly what are its basic assumptions, right, and you create new connections and new concepts arise as a result, and then eventually they may disintegrate as that shared collective understanding, right, begins to disseminate. And that seems to me part of the work of what's being done here in terms of this tracing of the dynamics of concepts. Now, I might make a big picture argument about this. I'm not sure this is in the book, but I'm curious, and so I'm going to raise the question. So were I to speculate about what kind of history of legal consciousness might underlie all three examples you gave, both of Gezel, Hitmodedut, and Brera, it seems to me some basic shift. I'm not endorsing this, but I'm wondering if this is what's going on. A basic shift between what you call the naturalistic approach to language and to law of the Tanaim and the far more constitutive, conventional, right, way of approaching legal concepts that the Amoraim have. It plays a role in all three of your examples. That's that kind of shift in legal consciousness. If it's so, it is the kind of shift in legal consciousness that helps to account for an emergence of new concepts and then perhaps for their eventual demise. So I'm kind of curious about that. In any event, I really want to thank you for forcing me to really reach out of my element, and I hope to engage more in the future. Thanks.